Hello all. Before we get into our topics for today, I just thought that there would be something interesting that I would show you on Google Earth. So Google Earth has gone through an update recently, and it's actually a really cool update. So they offer you a lot more information on places and more three-dimensional views. And so we're learning about Australia right now, along with other places as well, and they will do guided tours. They have historical maps that you can look at. For example, this guided tour that I clicked on will show me different locations and will take me to those places along the guided tour. So, and some of them are already places that we've looked at, like Uluru. There's the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So I suggest I'll post the link that I used for this guided tour, but after this, go on a guided tour of Australia. See if there's other places, maybe in Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, or New Zealand that you'd be interested in seeing, and just go for a guided tour. It's a really cool function that Google Earth has. But I want to get us into section 3. So section 3, the Pacific today. Let me just, no, I did a thing. I need to press this button. Boom, there we go. Okay, Australia and the Pacific today. You have quite the amount of vocabulary words to go through, but you can do it. But Australia and the Pacific are home to many cultures and ethnic groups, such as Jack's Maori people in New Zealand, Jack from the My Story. They have a blend of cultures and traditions as well. Australia and New Zealand are considered first world countries and are highly developed with industry. The smaller Pacific islands have less technology, rely heavily on tourism for their economy, and using of natural resources. So, in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, they have a very diverse ethnic groups and cultures. More and more Australians are European in ancestry. That means the people before them came from Europe, and same with New Zealand. But in the 1970s, more Pacific Islanders and Asians have also moved to these two countries. One population of culture that has gone down is Indigenous people. Remember, Indigenous people in Australia, or native people to Australia, are Aboriginals, like the Native Americans of America. 1% of Australians' 22 million people are Aboriginal, because British settlers and the Australian government mistreated them, and a lot of them died from disease and just bad times in Australian history. And in 2008, the Australian government apologized for not treating the Aborigines nicely. We have a picture of an Aboriginal girl from Australia right here. Jack himself is part Maori, which are the indigenous people in New Zealand. We have Samoan girls wearing woven grass and beaded headbands, and then someone from Papua New Guinea taking place in a traditional celebration. So one area, but they all look very, very different. New Zealand has more indigenous people than Australia, with about 8% of New Zealand's 4 million being Maori. The Maori were forced to adopt British customs, however, they have still managed to hold on to some of their culture. And they have gained some political power. New Zealand government has paid hundreds of millions of dollars to Maori groups as a way of saying, hey, we're sorry for being so mean to you and taking your land in the past. Australians and New Zealanders are healthy and well educated and are expected to live long lives. However, the native Aborigines and Maori living in those areas have a lower standard of living and lower level of education. But people in the government are trying to work on making that more equal. In the Pacific Islands, they have a lot of different languages, religions, and customs. In some of these regions, the islands were very isolated and didn't have a lot of contact outside of their island. Some were kingdoms spread over chains of islands. Pacific people once practiced hundreds of different religions, however, most of them are Christian today, and most Pacific Islanders are still indigenous. So not like the amount of European people that have come to Australia and New Zealand. Some islanders keep traditional customs. Pacific Islanders practice forms of art, dance, and music. Thinking of like hula dancing, stuff like that, very traditional in Hawaii. Australia and New Zealand were once owned by Great Britain, if you remember that. And they're both parliamentary democracies, which mean it's similar to Canada, kind of. Citizens elect representatives to a parliament or a legislature, and the parliament chooses a prime minister. So yeah, it is like Canada. The prime minister and the parliament govern the county. However, Queen Elizabeth II, if you see her right here, she is the official head of state of Australia and New Zealand. Same thing with Canada. However, she doesn't have really power over these, but she's kind of more just a figurehead or a symbol of the British colonies. Australia has 6 states. I actually remember I had to learn these in school at one point. These states have a great deal of power to govern themselves, kind of like American states have their own powers as well. New Zealand doesn't have any provinces or states, but it still has local governments. Citizens of Australia and New Zealand have individual rights and responsibilities. In Australia, they have really cracked down on gun control, though. They have a lot of limitations on gun control. Australians also have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Australians, however, are required to vote, and if they do not vote, they would be fined for failing to vote, just like in some other countries that we've learned about this year. So, don't want to be fined. In America, you're not fined for not voting, but in other countries, you can be. In the Pacific Islands, most of the governments are democratic, which means the people get to have a say in government. Some of these countries are corrupt. Fiji's military has led 4 coups since 1987. A coup, not a coup, a coup is short for the French word coup d'état, and it is a sudden, violent overthrow of a government, often by the military. Suriname actually went through a coup as well in the 80s. They're not fun, and so that's not good that there's been 4 coups since 1987. That's a couple years older than Mrs. Bulwark. We have Australian Parliament building right here. And right here we have a Papua New Guinea man waiting to vote. All right. What do you do? What do you say? It's time for a Dutch word of the day. Your Dutch word for Wednesday, May 6th is dankjewel. Dankjewel. Dank je wel. Dankjewel. So, what does dankjewel mean? It means thank you. Dankjewel. Thank you. Can you say it? Dank je wel. Dankjewel. All right. And this ends where we're going to stop for today's video. Please check out the guided tour on Google Earth. It just seems very interesting and cool. Maybe you'll find a guided tour for New Zealand as well. I'm sure that would be absolutely beautiful. New Zealand is very beautiful. And you can start working on your homework for Friday if you want to at this time as well. All right, I will see you tomorrow.